Hello students, and welcome back to this Lightboard video lesson. Today we're going to derive the supply curve, introducing the concept of supply, the supply curve function, the supply table, and then the supply curve itself on a graph. Now I'm going to move a little bit faster on this video because I will have assumed you've watched the demand video next to it, okay, where I spend a little more time breaking down this detail here. Okay. Well, who does supply represent? Well, it represents producers. And we break these down into two subgroups, and it's going to be the price that the producers receive for the good that is going to determine whether they are in the seller group or the non-seller group. Okay? What are they producing? Well, that is our good or service that we would call Q, we would denote with QS. Okay? All right, so like with the demand curve, we have the price, which we'll make short with the letter P, and we're going to have quantity supplied, which we're going to denote with QS. Okay. Sometimes you'll see it as a superscript, sometimes you'll see it as a subscript. I try to keep it as a superscript there. Okay. All right, so our quantity supplied there. Okay, where do producers get to be sellers or non-sellers? Well, again, in a market. And that's where they're going to meet consumers, who are going to make up the other side of the market, which is the demand curve. Okay, when? Well, what you're going to see on this schedule and in this graph is what is current, so think in terms of today, and it's going to be measured in per units, per period there. Okay. All right, so where's the quantity going to go? Well, the quantity is going to go on the x-axis or the horizontal axis, and then on the y-axis or vertical axis, we're going to have everything in dollar terms here. So we're going to put our price, P, on the vertical axis, so all these are dollar terms. And we're still talking about oil in this example, as shown by chapter 3 from your textbook. So it's price per barrel. And then we're going to have our number of barrels. Okay, so have our quantity supplied of oil in million barrels of oil per day. So that's what that MBD in your textbook stands for. And that's million barrels of oil per day. Okay. All right. So I've started to plot out some of this supply curve here. So we'll start from the top. Okay. Sellers like really high prices. And why would producers sell? Okay. Well, why is because they are willing and able to sell. And that's ultimately determined by their cost. Okay, we're just going to call it cost, although technically it's marginal cost. But for now, we'll just call it cost. Okay, so why? Because they're willing and able to sell at that price. Okay, so they can cover the costs. Okay, so how are they able to produce? Well, how are those producers able to sell? Well, they have to have a price that they can receive that is greater than or equal to their cost. And when that happens, they can make a profit. Okay. All right. So let's start with that first unit there. When the price is high at $55, mark it right here, they're willing and able to sell up to 50 million barrels of oil per day. Okay? Because at that point, at 50 million barrels of oil per day, that 50 millionth barrel produced that day is going to have a cost of exactly $55 for that barrel. Okay? And so, at that point, they would make as much on that as they would before. So let's go ahead and mark that with the 50. Okay, and so I'm going to put a little coordinate here. When the quantity is 50, the price is $55 per barrel. Okay. All right, now when the price drops to $20 per barrel, there are some higher cost levels of production that the firms can no longer produce and make a profit, or they're going to make a loss. And so at a price of $20 per barrel, the most that they're willing and able to produce is 30 million barrels of oil per day. So, by the way, this quantity is in barrels, million barrels of oil per day. Okay. So when we go down, the price falls from 55 up here to down to 20. Then they are producing 30 million barrels of oil per day. Okay. And when the price drops even further, let me actually add the coordinates here. So 30 units, price is $20 per barrel. All right, so now we can connect these two dots. And then we've got our third price and quantity supplied pair. At $5 per barrel, we found that firms were willing and able to produce 10 million barrels of oil per day. So we'll do 5 and 10. So 10 barrels are produced when the price is $5 per barrel. All right, so there's our supply curve mapped out, okay? All right, so let's take a break and come over to the function here. So QS, our quantity supplied, is a function of the price per barrel. Okay, so this is our dependent variable. And then all of these things on the right are independent variables. All right, so price is one of them. We've already established that this is on the horizontal axis, and that this is on the vertical axis. And then everything else is going to make the supply curve shift. So we'll just call those shifters. Okay? All right, so what are some of those things that might cause it to shift? Well, we'll get to those in a minute. Okay. First we want to do is we want to be able to read this supply curve, okay? And you'll see that when the price goes up, the quantity supplied also increases. Okay, this is a positive relationship, and everywhere you look on the supply curve, the slope is positive. And so what we'll have here is if we are to read any point on this on the supply curve, we could have a horizontal reading. Okay, so horizontal reading. So we go until we hit the curve, and then we go down, okay? So if we did that for $55 per barrel, we'd say at a price of $55 per barrel, the most that producers are willing and able to sell is 50 million barrels of oil per day. We could also take that same approach to this point and use a vertical reading. And so it's a for 50 million barrels of oil produced per day, the minimum price that producers are willing and able to accept is $55 per barrel. Okay. What I'm also saying here is that when you look at the y coordinate along the supply curve, we're not only mapping price per barrel, we're mapping out cost. And so what we have here is we have this positive relationship between price and quantity supplied. And that's our law of supply, that price and quantity supplied move in the same direction. Okay? All right. So let's talk about some shifters here. Okay. So the law of supply is saying hold all other independent variables constant, but if one of those independent variables hold constant, we still want to represent this upward sloping supply curve, but we have to move it to another location. So if we have an improvement in technology, then we are willing and able to produce more at each and every price. That is the horizontal reading of an increase in supply. And so if I take this point right here, and I do an increase, sorry for overriding my coordinate here, in supply, we would say we'd move this point right here. So previously at $20 per barrel, the most that producers were willing and able to produce is 30 million barrels of oil per day, but now because they got better extraction technology, they can produce an extra 10 million barrels of oil per day. Okay. And so that would also mean that at 30 million barrels of oil per day, their production costs are in fact lower. And so now they might be willing and able to accept a price as low as $10 per barrel. Okay. And so an increase in supply would be a shift to the right using the horizontal reading and a shift downward using the vertical reading of an increase in supply. And so I'm just going to kind of interpolate, guess where these other points would be. And so we have our old supply here and our new supply here. Okay. All right. What else can we cover? Well, if we take this line here and we go ahead and draw this to the vertical axis here, and we take this price here of 20, we can remember that everything that's on this axis is going to be represented in dollar terms, and it's going to be a price per barrel. In the case, since we're looking at the supply curve, it's also the cost of the 10 millionth, 20 millionth, 30 millionth, 40 millionth barrel. Okay. So as long as the seller is receiving more than it's costing them to make each consecutive barrel of oil, they're going to keep producing. And so this is going to give us something we call producer surplus. right, so producer surplus. And that would be the area underneath the price line of what they receive and above the cost, which is actually the y coordinate of this old supply curve here. All right, so what does this also mean? Well, it means that if the price is 20, this separates the high cost non-sellers from the low cost sellers. So all the sellers who can produce units for less than the price of $20 will get to sell the product, and those who are higher cost producers or have higher cost production units, those units will not get sold. Okay. All right, other things that affect the desire for producers to be willing and able to sell, basically anything that affects profitability or costs, okay? So another thing would be like the input prices. And the input prices means like, labor costs, capital equipment costs, things like that. Then we've got, the number of producers, which will be modeled as entry and exit of producers. Then we've got expectations. And then finally, changes in opportunity costs. Okay. I also forgot one more here. Let's add in taxes and subsidies. So at this point, I'm out of lightboard space, and so I leave it to you guys to look on to chapter 3 and we talk about the supply curve shifters. But one thing that will really just kind of help you is to think about, like, well, how does it affect my per unit production cost, and how does it affect my willingness to sell, okay? And so if you have a lowering of per unit production cost, you're going to have an increase in supply. It's going to shift in this direction. And if you have a increase in per unit production cost, you're going to have a decrease in supply. It's going to shift in this direction. Okay? Thank y'all. We'll see you at the next video.